They wrote down her price the way someone might jot the cost of a bent nail. Lot 17, female child, approximate age. What would you say, Mr. Dobbs? The trader narrowed his eyes at the small figure standing on the block. She was barefoot, her ankles too thin for the iron ring that had hung there the month before, when she had belonged to another man's list. Her dress was hardly more than a gray rag, wet from the early drizzle. 8, 9, he muttered. Hard to judge when they're stunted. She doesn't look like much. The crowd shifted its weight. Most men had no interest in children that young. A boy might grow into a plow hand, a girl into a field worker, or worse. But it took years of feeding before either returned the cost. And this one carried that hollow look that told a story of someone trying to make her labor like a grown woman and almost squeezing the life from her. Up close, her eyes were the only part that did not seem worn down. Too large for her narrow face, dark and steady, watching everything without giving anything away. When the trader's assistant seized her chin and turned her head roughly from side to side, she did not cry. She only stared at the row of men studying her, as if she were the single person in the yard who fully understood what the chalked numbers meant. Mother dead, the trader called out. Came in through a debt settlement. Previous owner let her run near wild. Could be trained for house duties. Could be set to light field work. Breeding potential in a few years, he added, saying it like a man pointing to a sapling that might one day bear fruit. A few men laughed. One muttered, I ain't paying good money to raise another man's mistakes. At the edge of the circle, Henry Caldwell shifted from one boot to the other and tried not to think about his own mistakes waiting back at the plantation. The folded letter in his coat pocket, pressed against his chest. Another notice from the bank. Polite language, wrapped around unforgiving numbers. Interest. Arrears. Collateral. The kind of words that made a man feel like dry land split open without rain, cracked and ready to break apart. He had not come to town planning to buy anyone. He had come to speak with Mr. Hathaway at the bank about extending his note. But Hathaway had been delayed on other business, and the auction yard had a habit of pulling a man in while he waited. Habit more than desire. Come now, gentlemen, Dobbs called. She may be small, but she's sound. No clear deformities. Teeth fair. You can see she's got all her fingers. He lifted the girl's hand, prying her fingers apart for display. Something small, dirty, and frayed shifted at her wrist, a thin string with a scrap of cloth tied to it, the remnant of some long-forgotten ribbon or tag. Before Henry could study it further, the trader dropped her hand. Who'll start me at $2? Dobbs asked. Silence. A cough. A laugh. Someone spat into the mud. The rain fell heavier, tapping against hats and shoulders. All right then, Dobbs said, forcing a tight smile. $1. You won't find a cheaper lot today. Nothing. The girl shifted her stance. The plank beneath her feet creaked softly. She looked over the sea of faces and found nothing gentle there. If fear lived inside her, it had long ago learned how to sit quietly. Henry's gaze drifted again to the letter crushed in his pocket. $1 might as well have been 100 when a man was short on every payment that mattered. Still, something like shame crept along his neck as he watched no one lift a hand for a living child. Dobbs wiped rain from his brow. All right, gentlemen, let's not play stubborn. Who'll begin at 50 cents? A man near the front snorted. She ain't worth the trouble. I got dogs at home that eat more than she'll ever be worth. Another voice drawled. I'd take her for 20 cents just to keep flies off your block. You sold him a broom for that yesterday, someone else called out. The jokes stacked up, cheap and careless, each one shaving away another piece of whatever remained of the girl's sense of being human. Henry shifted again, irritation rising in him. It was not kindness stirring there. It was another kind of discomfort, the kind a man felt when he saw a scene that brushed too close to his own worries. He was tired of hearing numbers pinned to things he could barely afford, tired of the bank measuring his worth line by line. His hand lifted before he had fully made up his mind. 19 cents, he called, his voice cutting through the noise. The yard went quieter than such a small bid deserved. Dobbs blinked. Come again, Mr. Caldwell. 19, Henry repeated. You want to scrape the bottom? Might as well do it properly. I'll take her for 19 cents and spare you the cost of feeding her another week. A few men laughed again, this time with a trace of rough admiration. Trust Caldwell to bargain the price of a child lower than a postage stamp. Dobbs hesitated, pride wrestling with sense. Every day an unsold lot remained cost him money. This one had already been refused in 2 other towns. She was becoming a burden. "Do I hear better than 19? He called. 20? 25? Anyone? The yard answered only with rain and silence. At last, Dobbs sighed. "Sold," he said, "to Mr. Henry Caldwell for the fine sum of 19 cents. The worn gavel struck the block with a hollow thud that sounded too much like a door closing. The girl did not move. No one cheered. She stepped down when the assistant jerked his head. The chain at her ankle clinked softly as they unclasped it. She stumbled once on the slick step, then steadied herself without help. Up close, Henry saw that the scrap of cloth at her wrist had once been blue, striped faintly with white, now faded to the color of an old sky. 2 small letters were stitched there in uneven thread, nearly rubbed away by time and grime. "Tag from the last owner," Dobbs said, noticing his look. "You can cut it off. Means nothing now." The last thing he needed was another man's mark on something he had paid for, however small the cost. In the trader's office, he counted out the coins with a stiff shake of his head. "You planning to put that one to work in the house?" the clerk asked, while scratching out a receipt. "Maybe," Henry answered. "Maybe I'll have her carry kindling until she grows into something useful. Can't be worse than some of the stock I've got now." "You'd be surprised," the clerk muttered. "Trouble comes in all sizes." When Henry stepped back outside, the girl stood where they had left her, small and damp but stubbornly upright. He studied her for a moment. "What's your name?" he asked. Names had been taken from her before, traded like everything else. "They called me Nora," she said at last. "They?" he asked. She lifted one thin shoulder. "The last place. You had another before that?" Her eyes flickered. He glimpsed something there. Maybe loss or a memory pushed so deep it surfaced only when startled. "Yes, sir," she said. He did not press further. The story of which man had first bought her mother, of which paper carried the original price, was not something he needed to settle his accounts. He jerked his chin toward the street. "Come on then, Nora. For now," he said. "We'll see what 19 cents buys these days." As they walked toward the buggy, rain tapping against his hat and soaking into her hair, he felt a strange, uneasy satisfaction. There was something almost defiant about attaching such a small figure to a purchase. When the bank reviewed his books, they would see the usual feed, tools, minor additions to stock. No one would look twice at a single line reading, "One female child, 0.19. To Henry it was a bitter joke he could afford, a story to tell about how tight times were that he bought children for loose change. To Nora, it was a number that would settle deep in her bones. 19 cents. Less than a decent meal in town, less than a cheap knife. A price that declared she was not even worth a full round number. The buggy jolted over ruts outside town. Nora gripped the side, balancing herself by instinct. Henry watched her from the corner of his eye, noticing how she scanned the roadside, how certain noises made her flinch, while others did not. "You from around here?" he asked suddenly. She shook her head. "Don't know," she said. "Been moved too much." Her fingers brushed the faded cloth at her wrist without thinking. For a brief moment, Henry saw the letters again. MB, or perhaps NB, the stitching too worn to be certain. Something about them tugged faintly at his memory, a shape half remembered from some paper he had once signed without reading carefully. He frowned and pushed the thought aside. He had greater worries than a scrap of cloth tied to a cheap child. The farm needed a new gin belt. The bank demanded its money. His wife's latest letter from her father mentioned concerns about his management of Margaret's dowry assets. Words that made his jaw tighten. If there was any connection between the girl beside him and the lines in his ledger, he did not see it. Not yet. The Caldwell place rose from the mist an hour later. 2 stories of peeling white paint border D by rows of cotton that looked greener from afar than they did close up. The slave quarters crouched behind, like low, dark shadows. As they rolled into the yard, a few heads turned. Curiosity was the only luxury the enslaved people allowed themselves freely. Henry climbed down and nodded for Nora to follow. You'll take orders from the housekeeper for now, he said. Light tasks. We'll decide later where to place you. As he handed her over to the older woman at the kitchen door, he noticed the housekeeper's eyes narrow slightly at the sight of the girl's face. What? He asked, sharper than he meant to. Nothing, sir, the woman replied quickly. But when he turned away, she looked at Nora again, more closely this time, as though staring at a ghost dressed in rags. You come with me, child, she murmured. We'll get you cleaned up. In the dim kitchen light, with rain drumming on the roof and the scent of simmering beans in the air, the housekeeper took a damp cloth to Nora's wrist. She wiped away years of dirt until the faded blue scrap became clearer. The letters stitched into it stood out just enough to read. M.B. The housekeeper's breath caught in her throat. Her thoughts flew to another piece of cloth packed years earlier into a trunk that had arrived at this same house on another rainy day. A trunk that had belonged to Miss Margaret Beaumont before she became Mrs. Caldwell. That can't be, the housekeeper murmured under her breath. Nora glanced up. Ma'am? Nothing, the woman answered too fast. She cleared her throat. Do you remember where you got this? Nora frowned a little. My first mama tied it on me, she said slowly. Said it was so I wouldn't get lost. They tried to cut it off when they sold me, but I bit. A small flash of stubborn pride crossed her face. I kept it. The housekeeper's hands began to tremble. She had been in this household long enough to remember the day another young woman had been sold away from this family in a different town, under a different name. Long enough to recall the half-heard gossip about a Beaumont girl who had gone too far with someone she should not have, and the quiet vanishing that followed. She stared at the letters again. M.B. Margaret's maiden name had been Beaumont. Her oldest sister had been named Mary Ann. Lord help us, the housekeeper breathed. 19 cents. The master believed he had bought a cheap child. He had not yet understood that he had brought something else onto his land. A living piece of his wife's family past, stitched to a scrap of cloth, carrying a connection every ledger in town had tried to erase. Hester did not sleep that night. She lay on her pallet near the kitchen door, eyes wide open, ears filled with the old sounds of the house. Mice scratching in the walls, wind brushing the shutters, someone in the quarters coughing in the dark. But her thoughts were somewhere else. In another time, another town, watching another girl step into a carriage with a trunk that had a blue-striped ribbon tied around its handle. Mary Ann Beaumont, Miss Margaret's older sister, had laughed that day. People always laughed around her. She laughed when her mother scolded her, laughed when her father warned her about certain friendships that were not proper for a lady. She had even laughed when Hester had whispered, Miss Mary Ann, you be careful now. White girls don't get to play with fire and walk away without burns. Then, one day, the laughter stopped. There were whispers behind closed doors. Visits from a doctor, from a pastor, from men whose voices carried words like shame and situation. Mary Ann's belly had grown round, and then suddenly she was gone, sent away to visit relatives for a season that stretched into a year. When she returned thinner and quieter, there was a new hardness in Mr. Beaumont's eyes, and a strict new rule in the house. No one was to speak of that year or anything that had happened during it, ever again. Hester never saw the baby. She only heard soft crying one night through a wall, and saw, the next morning, a small bundle carried out the back door. A scrap of blue-striped cloth had hung for a moment from the blanket, then disappeared into the carriage. Now, years later, she stared at the same pattern tied around a slave child's wrist. The thread was cheaper, the cloth more worn, but the stripes were the same. Hold still, she told Nora, her voice tighter than she meant it to be. I'm just looking. Nora did not pull away. She was used to other people's hands moving her about like furniture. My mama, she repeated. The first one. She worked in a house, not the fields. Said this meant I wasn't to be mixed up or forgotten. And that work out for her? Hester asked before she could stop herself. Nora's eyes turned flat. They sold her, she said. Sold me after. So I guess not. Hester released the child's wrist. You keep that on, she said. No matter who tells you to cut it off. You hear? Yes, ma'am, Nora answered, surprised by the sharpness in her tone. Now hush, Hester said. We've got work come morning. But when morning arrived, Hester's first errand was not the stove. It was the big house. She waited until she heard Mr. Caldwell ride out, lightly off to argue with the bank again. His leaving made the house feel looser, like a belt let out one notch. The moment his horse's hoofbeats faded down the lane, Hester wiped her hands on her apron and climbed the back stairs. She found Margaret in the sitting room, a book open in her lap, her eyes not moving over the page. The mistress looked up as Hester stepped inside. "Yes," she asked. "Is there trouble?" "In the kitchen." "Not in the kitchen, ma'am," Hester said. "In the yard, maybe. In the past, surely." "You're speaking in riddles, Hester." "I'm speaking of threads," Hester replied, moving closer. "Threads from a cloth I've seen before." She lifted her roughened hand and mimed a band around her wrist. Blue stripes, white between. 2 letters stitched clumsy but loving. M and B. Margaret's face lost its color so quickly Hester thought she might faint. "Where did you see that?" she whispered. "On the new girl the master brought home last night," Hester said. "The 19-cent child. He calls her Nora." Margaret shut the book, her fingers pressing hard into the cover. "You must be mistaken," she said automatically. "Maybe," Hester allowed. "But I saw that cloth once before on a trunk. What came back without the baby that left with it?" The air between them grew thick. "You're speaking of my sister," Margaret said at last. "Of Marianne." Hester inclined her head. "I was here then. I remember the doctors, the trip to relatives, the way your mother stopped letting her out without someone watching, then being sent away again, this time quiet. And that bundle went out the back door with a scrap of sky tied to it." Margaret's jaw tightened. "My father handled it," she said stiffly. "Arrangements were made." "The child," she began, then stopped, swallowing the next words. "The child was placed." That was the phrase they had used in soft voices over brandy. Placed, like china in a cabinet. "How old would that child be now?" Hester asked, gently. "If she lived, or 10. "She's standing in your kitchen," Hester said, calling herself Nora, "with your family's letters tied to her wrist so she wouldn't be lost." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, then dropped as if she had caught herself showing too much. "No," she whispered. "My father would never. Would never." "Would never what?" Hester asked quietly. "Sell his own blood? Send a baby somewhere no one could ask questions? You sure you want to finish that thought, ma'am?" Memories crashed into Margaret like waves. Her father's hard voice, the pastor's gentle lies about forgiveness, her mother's red eyes, Marianne's laughter turning brittle and thin, the way they spoke of the incident, using words like regrettable and unfortunate, and handled. "You said the tag was MB?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Hester answered. "Marianne Beaumont. Or some other girl with the same letters who cried in the same room and vanished the same way. Coincidence like that, I don't trust much." Margaret turned toward the window, looking out at the fields, the rows of cotton blurred before her eyes. "What are you asking me to believe?" she said. "That the child in my kitchen is what? My niece? My sister's shame? A reminder of a scandal my family paid dearly to bury?" "I ain't asking you to believe anything," Hester said. "I'm telling you what my eyes saw then, and what they see now. What you do with it is yours to carry." Silence stretched long between them. A fly buzzed in the warm air. "Does Mr. Caldwell know?" Margaret asked at last. "Not yet," Hester replied. "Far as he's concerned, she's just another mouth for you to feed and him to work. 19 cents worth of trouble." Margaret let out a breath that sounded too close to a sob. "Do you think I should tell him?" she asked. Hester paused. "You want my honest mind?" "I didn't call you up here for lies," Margaret snapped, then softened. "Please." "Then no, ma'am," Hester said. "A man who sees 19 cents when he looks at a child don't deserve to know what she truly cost your sister." The tea afternoon. Margaret went to the kitchen herself, something she rarely did unless there was a gathering to oversee. The enslaved women straightened at once, hands moving faster over pots and knives. Hester pretended to fuss with a sack of flour, watching from the corner of her eye. Nora stood at the table sorting beans. She had washed as best she could. Beneath the dirt, her features were finer than anyone had noticed. Her nose tipped slightly at the end, her mouth pressed tight when she focused, a look that struck Margaret with a memory she had tried to bury. Mary Ann squinting at her embroidery, tongue peeking out the same careless way. "What did you say your name was?" Margaret asked. "Nora," the girl replied stiffly. "Who gave it to you?" "My first mama," Nora said. She said it sounded like no rain and no running mixed together. Things she wished she could give me. Margaret's throat tightened. "Hold out your hand," she said. Nora obeyed. The blue strip around her wrist seemed smaller now that Margaret truly saw it. "Who tied this?" Margaret asked softly, her fingers brushing the cloth. "Mama," Nora answered. "She said if anybody ever looked close, they'd see I belonged to something." She was right, Margaret murmured before she could stop herself. "Ma'am?" Margaret let the cloth fall. "Nothing. You'll work in the house from now on. Hester will show you your duties." "Yes, ma'am," Nora said. As Margaret turned to leave, Nora spoke again, the question bursting out of her. "Ma'am, do you know who my father is?" Hester closed her eyes. Margaret's hand tightened on the doorframe. "Children like you seldom get neat answers to that," she said, not unkindly. "Sometimes the truth is a knife we cannot afford to hold." "I just wanted to know if he ever looked for me," she said. Margaret swallowed hard. "If he did," she said, "he must have looked in the wrong place. Men like him always do." She walked away before the girl could press her further. That night in their bedroom, Henry flung the bank letter under the dresser with a curse. "Hathaway is tightening the screws again," he muttered. "Says if we do not show progress by harvest, he will have to review the terms." The man talks as if he is discussing the weather. Margaret sat at her vanity, slowly brushing her hair. In the mirror, she watched her husband's reflection pace across the room. "Perhaps if you spent less time at Dobbs' auctions and more hours in the fields," she said lightly. "I hardly spent anything today," he snapped. "Picked up that little girl for less than a cup of coffee, cheaper than a fence post. She might even make herself useful." "Is that how you measure usefulness?" Margaret asked. "By the price of purchase?" "Yes," he said flatly. "Isn't that how your father measures everything he lends us?" The mention of her father made her flinch. The man who had handled Mary Ann's situation, the man whose money Henry was now sinking beneath. "You gave the girl a name?" Henry asked, more to fill the silence than from real curiosity. "She already had one," Margaret replied. "Nora." "Fine," he said. "Nora Caldwell's property. We will see if she earns her 19 cents. He did not notice the way Margaret's fingers tightened around the brush. A few days later, a letter arrived from her father. It came folded neatly in a hand that had never known a single day of hard labor. Margaret carried it to the parlor to read alone. Outside, the sun beat down on the fields. Inside, her world narrowed to ink and paper. "Concerned to hear of your husband's ongoing troubles with the Hathaway note. You must impress upon him the importance of protecting our family's standing. You know I have carried more than my share of unfortunate outcomes. Ready." That phrase again. Her eyes caught on the line halfway down the page. "I trust you remember, without my needing to be explicit, the necessary corrections made when your sister's youthful foolishness threatened to stain our name forever. I will not have my grandchildren, or their husbands, dragging us once more into such murky waters." Her stomach tightened. Murky waters. Necessary corrections. A baby carried out the back door, with blue-striped cloth tied at the wrist. She read the paragraph twice, then a third time as if repetition might change the meaning. In the days that followed, she began to watch Nora the way a woman studies an old portrait, searching for familiar features, looking for echoes of people she once knew. The tilt of the girl's head when she listened, the way she chewed the inside of her cheek when she felt nervous, the small, stubborn lift of her chin when she was scolded. One evening at supper, Henry barked at Nora for spilling a bit of gravy on the tablecloth. "For God's sake, girl," he snapped. "It is not so hard to hold a spoon steady." Nora's shoulders bent, but her eyes flashed. "My hand steady enough when I am working," she muttered softly. "Maybe the table is what is crooked." It was exactly the kind of thing Mary Ann would have said to their father, quiet but clear enough to be heard, daring him to push further. Margaret's breath caught. For a moment, she was not looking at a slave child. She was seeing her sister across a dinner table years ago, watching her resist their father with humor instead of shouting. Henry slammed his palm against the table. What did you say? Nothing, sir, Nora answered quickly. Margaret's voice cut through the tension. She said she will be more careful. The lie came smoothly. And she will, won't you, Nora? Yes, ma'am, Nora murmured. Later that night, when Henry had stepped onto the porch to smoke and complain about the weather, Margaret found Nora in the pantry stacking jars with careful, almost obsessive precision. You must not talk back to him, Margaret said quietly. Not even a little. He owns my back, Nora replied without turning. Not my tongue. For now, he owns both, Margaret said softly. That is the curse of this place. She stepped closer. Do you know how old you are, Nora? About 10, Nora said. Maybe 11. How long ago did your mama tie that ribbon on you? Nora frowned as she tried to remember. I was real small, could still sit on her hip. She used to tell me, do not ever forget where you come from, even if they change your name 10 times. Then she would tap it right here. Nora touched the strip of cloth, said it was my reminder. Did she ever say where she worked? Margaret asked. Before, in a big house, Nora answered. Said the lady there was pretty but sad. Said the man who owned it liked to decide everything. Who smiled, who cried, but she never told their names. Just that they were important. Important. A clean word for people who could make babies disappear when they did not fit the picture. Margaret felt something inside her settle into a cold and terrible certainty. The timeline matched. The letters matched. The habits matched. Nora was not just any child. She was the living result of Marianne's youthful mistake, the fragile secret her father had tried to erase with money and distance. Somehow, through bad luck or cruel irony, she had been sold from place to place until she stood on the block the same day Henry decided to waste an hour at the auction. The plantation master had bought a young slave for 19 cents. He had also unknowingly purchased his wife's blood. That night Margaret lay awake beside her husband and studied his face in the dark. He snored softly, unaware. The man who worried over books, who counted bales and coins, had no idea that the cheapest purchase he ever made might prove the most costly in ways he could never imagine. In the morning she went to her writing desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. Her hand trembled only slightly as she wrote to her father. She did not mention Nora by name. She asked, only in careful words, whether all matters regarding past family indiscretions remained settled and unreachable. She already knew what answer would come. Yes, all handled, all placed, all forgotten. That was how men like him slept at night. But as she sealed the letter, she understood something else. The child in her kitchen was a crack in that story. A flaw in the carefully painted portrait of the Beaumont line, a reminder that blood and ink did not always follow the same rules. Her husband saw 19 cents on a receipt. She saw her sister's eyes in a small, stubborn face, and her father's pride in the fact that that face now scrubbed his son-in-law's floors. The hidden connection sat at their table, refilled their cups and listened. And sooner or later, Margaret knew, Henry Caldwell would realize that the girl he had bought like a trinket had more claim to his house than any stranger he had sold to cover his debts. The only question was what he would do when he finally understood. Henry noticed it, the way a man notices a leak, too late and all at once. It began small. He stood in the yard one afternoon watching the hands bring in bales from the far field when he saw Nora walking ahead of the others, carrying a basket of mended clothes. The sun struck her at the right angle, lighting the side of her face, the tilt of her chin, the shape of her mouth when she narrowed her eyes against the light. Something about it caught his attention. For a moment he felt as if he were looking at Margaret as a girl, not the woman in his house now, stiffened by duty and quiet disappointment, but the younger version he had married, quicker to smile, sharper with her wit, less skilled at hiding anger. The feeling passed. He shook his head, annoyed with himself. People saw what they wanted to see. If he had married a farmer's daughter instead of a merchant's child, he would probably find her face in every milkmaid in the county. Still, the sense returned. At supper, when Nora poured his coffee, the way she shifted her weight was pure Beaumont, hips steady, shoulders straight. A certain natural grace he had always connected with good breeding, the phrase his father-in-law liked to repeat. He was not alone in noticing. You are letting the servants imitate their betters now, A neighbor joked over cards one evening, nodding toward Nora as she passed the open door. That one walks like she owns the place. The men laughed. Henry forced a smile, but the comment stayed with him like a splinter in the skin. That night in bed, he mentioned it to Margaret, half teasing, half uneasy. "Dobbs sold me one with airs this time," he said. "Little 10-year-old acting like she belongs at the main table." Margaret brushed her hair in long, steady strokes that had become a kind of armor. "Maybe she comes by it honestly," she said, eyes fixed on the mirror. "How is that?" Henry asked. "Some children are born into the wrong rooms," she replied. "It does not mean the blood forgets the right ones." He gave a short laugh. "You are starting to sound like your father. All that talk about lines and stock and proper breeding." "If I sounded like my father, Henry," she answered calmly, "that child would be on another man's ledger by now, far away, where no one could study her face and ask questions." The words struck him sideways. He rolled onto his back and stared at the ceiling. "What questions?" he asked after a pause. Margaret's brush slowed. "About why a little girl from nowhere wears cloth that looks like it came from a Beaumont trunk. About why her habits mirror members of my family who have never stepped foot on this plantation." He frowned. "What cloth?" "The band on her wrist," she said. "You did not notice." "I noticed a dirty scrap," he answered. "Dobbs said it was nothing." "Dobbs says many things," Margaret murmured. "Usually whatever makes a sale easier." Silence stretched between them, heavy with old stories neither wished to name. "You are suggesting what exactly?" Henry asked. Margaret set the brush down carefully. "I am suggesting," she said slowly, "that if you are going to buy children at auction for the price of pocket change, you should at least look closely at what you are buying. Names, marks, histories other men tried to bury." He turned his head toward her. "You think she is related to you?" "I think my father once paid good money to make sure my sister's baby became someone else's burden," Margaret said. "I think burdens have a habit of finding their way home." The idea unsettled him more than he cared to admit. A cheap child was simple. Blood complicated everything. Blood made a man feel as if the ground beneath him was less firm than he believed. "Even if that were true," he said, "what difference would it make? She is still a slave. The law does not change because of a scrap of cloth and your memories." Margaret's eyes turned cold. "The law is not the only ledger that counts," she said quietly. "Some accounts are kept elsewhere." He rolled his eyes, yet sleep did not come easily. A week later, the bank came calling. Mr. Hathaway arrived in a polished buggy with spotless boots and a briefcase that likely cost more than Nora's entire sale. He sat in Henry's study, turning the pages of the ledgers with narrow fingers, his lips pressed tight. "You are steady," he said at last, "but only barely. Any sudden trouble? A failed crop, a lame mule, a torn gin belt, and these figures fall the wrong direction." "I need time," Henry answered. "You've taken your interest. You've taken your principal when I could manage it. You've taken my sleep and my peace. How much more do you want?" Hathaway looked at him the way a man might look at a mule grumbling about its load. "The bank wants security," he said. "We are holding several troubled notes. The board is uneasy. It would calm their minds if you would name a small part of your movable property as added collateral." Henry's jaw grew tight. "Meaning what exactly?" Hathaway said. "We have listed certain slaves in the security agreement. They stay in your possession as long as you pay, of course, but if matters turn bad, the bank holds first claim." The word collateral had turned into a curse across the county. Men said it softly over whiskey, as if speaking it too loud might bring it down on them. Henry had heard enough tales to understand what it truly meant. When the numbers failed, human bodies were the first things changed into silver. "I've already pledged land," he argued. "Land is slow to move," Hathaway replied, "and the board is restless. A few younger slaves of good health and promise would go far toward steadying them." Henry's eyes shifted almost without thinking toward the window. Through the glass he saw the side yard where Nora was hanging damp laundry, arms lifting the sheet, face set in focus. Hathaway followed his glance. "That girl, for example," he said, eyed lightly. "Healthy, obedient, raised in the house. In a few years her value will increase." Henry stiffened. "She's new," he said. "Just settled." All the better, Hathaway answered. Fewer ties, no deep attachments. The words cut deeper than they should have. Henry thought of the nights he had watched Nora move through the house, and felt, he told himself, nothing more than a master's judgment of stock. She cost me 19 cents, he muttered. All the more reason to record her, Hathaway said. You lose almost nothing if we ever must seize. The bank, however, gains a strong asset to auction. The logic was cold but clear. Henry's debts were far more than 19 cents. The girl had been a careless purchase, almost a joke. Why not make her useful on paper? Put her down, then, he said, the words heavier than he expected. Nora, age 10 or 11, house-trained. Hathaway gave a thin smile. He opened his briefcase, drew out a clean sheet, then wrote her name in neat letters. You have others near that age? He asked. From the doorway, a throat cleared. Margaret, I believe that will be all for now, she said. Hathaway stood, fixing his smooth smile in place. Mrs. Caldwell, he said, always a pleasure. She did not return it. Your pleasure costs us dearly, she replied. I hope the bank rests well. The bank does not rest, Hathaway said, meaning it as humor. It failed. After he left, the house felt dipped in something bitter. Henry paced from room to room, muttering about interference and wives who did not grasp business. Margaret waited until he had worn himself out. Then she went to find Nora. She found the girl in the yard staring at the sky, as if trying to judge whether the clouds promised rain or only more heat. Come inside, Margaret said. We must talk. Nora's shoulders tightened. I done something wrong, ma'am. You stood in the wrong man's sight at the wrong moment, Margaret said. At is enough. In the parlor she seated the girl and explained as gently as one can explain something that holds no gentleness at all, what the word collateral meant. It's like being written on a list, Nora asked slowly. Yes, Margaret answered. A list the sheriff might come for if the numbers fail. Nora's hand moved to her wrist, fingers rubbing the cloth there. I already been on too many lists, she whispered. I know, Margaret said. And she truly did, more than Nora could guess. Can he do that? Nora asked. Put me on some bank paper like I'm a sack of corn. He can, Margaret said. He has. Nora's jaw set hard. Then what's the use of this? She demanded, tapping the ribbon. Mama said this would keep me from getting lost. It kept you, Margaret said softly, until now. It brought you as near to where you began as this world allows. Nora's eyes flashed. You mean here? To you? Margaret paused, then nodded. Yes, to me, to us. Then what are you going to do about it? Nora asked. The question would have earned her a whipping in most houses. Here it only hung between them, wild and true. Margaret thought of her father's letter, of his words about necessary corrections and family honor. She thought of Henry's careless shrug when he agreed to list Nora, as if adding a 10-year-old to danger was no more serious than selling a goat. I'm going to do what my father did, she said slowly, only in reverse. She went to her desk and opened the household ledger again. On the page where she tracked shoes and soap, she wrote, Blue cloth band, to be replaced with plain twine initials, MB removed. You cutting it off? Nora asked, stepping back, hand gripping her wrist. No, Margaret said. You keep it, but you do not wear it where men like Hathaway can see. You stitch it inside your dress, inside your pocket, somewhere. It remains yours. Nora eased a little. That all? She asked. No, Margaret replied. I am also moving you. Where? To the laundry house. You will sleep with the women there. On paper, you will be listed as field support. If Mr. Hathaway ever sends someone to count what he believes he owns, they will search for a house girl named Nora. I will make sure they do not find one. Nora frowned. You can do that. I am mistress of this house, Margaret said, a hard pride in her voice that had nothing to do with her husband. I know where everyone sleeps and where every book is kept. Men like Hathaway think that means I arrange flowers for their desks. They forget it also means I can misplace what they think belongs to them. That night, under darkness and the usual creaks of old timber, the Caldwell household carried out its quiet act of resistance. Hester sat in the laundry room with a candle, gently picking apart the stitches of Nora's ribbon. "Hold still," she whispered. "We do not want to tear it now. It has done its work too long to be tossed aside careless." When the cloth came free, she watched as Nora tucked it into the lining of her dress, sewing it in with small, determined pulls of thread. "Now," Hester said, "even if they strip you bare on some blot, only you and whoever undresses you will know it is there. That is your history." Guard it silent. Back in the big house, Margaret opened Henry's account book. She found the line where Hathaway had written Nora, female child, collateral. With a steady hand, she copied it into another ledger she kept for herself, one that tracked not money, but danger. Beside Nora's name, she wrote to be hidden if collection comes. 2 months later, the first real trial arrived. A drought bit into the fields. Harvests shrank. The figures in Hathaway's ledger did what numbers always do when rain disappears. They betrayed the people who depend on them. A letter came, formal and cold. "In light of your continued weakness, the bank will send an agent to inspect the collateral listed under your note." Henry swore for nearly an hour. Margaret felt the weight settle deep where worry lives. The agent came on a bright, pitiless morning. He wore the same style coat as Hathaway and carried the same kind of notebook. He walked the rows, counted the hands, made marks only he understood. "And the girl?" he asked at last, checking his list. "House servant, age 10, Nora listed as collateral A." Henry gestured toward the house. "Inside, I suppose," he said. "Ask my wife, she keeps the house records." The man approached the back door. Hester met him with straight spine and flour on her hands. "Neither girl called Nora," he said. "House servant. Hathaway's list." Hester wiped her hands on her apron, buying time. "We have more than one girl near that age," she said. "Maybe mistress can help you." Margaret appeared before he could push inside. "Is there trouble?" she asked. "Only confirming collateral, ma'am," the man replied. "The bank lists a house girl named Nora, age 10 or 11, in service here." Margaret shaped her face into mild confusion. "You must have all details," she said. "We have a girl by that name, but she has only just come up from the quarters. Too young for housework yet." Hester caught the signal. "That is right, ma'am. Our Nora is barely fit to hold a broom." Surely Mr. Hathaway meant one of Mr. Caldwell's older girls, Millicent perhaps, or Rose. "They have served in the house for years." The agent frowned and checked his paper. "It says recent purchase, juvenile, suitable for domestic training." "Are you saying this Nora is not such?" "I am saying," Margaret replied calmly, "that if the bank wishes to secure its interest, it would be wiser to look at the young men in the fields. They are strong, tested, and far easier to liquidate without upsetting my household." The cruelty of the suggestion tasted like dust, but she understood how men like him reasoned. Property meant crops and muscle, not girls with blue cloth hidden inside their dresses. The agent hesitated. The sun burned hot. The day stretched long. The bank did not pay extra to argue with respectable white women over one child, when there were rows of laborers ready to be turned into figures. "Very well," he said at last. "We will amend the record." His pencil scratched. Somewhere in his book the words "Nora Collateral" vanished, replaced by other names, men whose faces Margaret refused to picture too clearly. She would carry that choice in other restless nights. When he rode away, Hathaway's agent believed he had tightened the bank's hold. Henry believed he had escaped a harsher fate. Only 3 people knew what truly happened. Hester, who had watched one girl sold already and would not see another go without resistance. Margaret, who had spent her life arranging lives to suit men's ledgers, and at last arranged one for herself. And Nora, who slept in the laundry house with the ribbon against her skin, and counted each morning she woke on the same land, as a quiet victory against all the lists that promised otherwise. Years later, when people in the county spoke of the Caldwell place, they remembered the drought, the near loss, the way Henry Caldwell somehow kept the bank from taking all. Some said he had charmed Hathaway. Others whispered that his wife's family money stepped in unseen. No one spoke of a 10-year-old girl bought for 19 cents and almost lost again in the math. No one wrote that the plantation master who thought he had purchased cheap property had brought home his wife's hidden blood. But in the quarters, in whispers passed from mother to daughter, the story remained sharp. He bought her for less than a cup of coffee, they would say, and never knew he paid for the right to sit at table with his own wife's kin. And somewhere, in an old trunk beneath dresses that carried a faint scent of sea air and regret, there lay another scrap of cloth, once tied to a different baby's wrist. It bore the same letters, M.B. The first had been sent away, the second had returned. Not even 19 cents could stop blood from finding its path.